We were driving to a Barrett family reunion when my husband asked me to check the directions on his phone. Classic rock played softly. Suddenly, a message flashed on his screen. It said a mobile notary was confirmed for 3:40, reminding him to bring his ID and the blue tab packet. In my profession, those words never mean a harmless family barbecue. I felt a cold chill and immediately told Nate to turn the car around. I am Ava Hernandez. I am 36 years old, and for the past 10 years, I have made my living looking for the lie. As a senior closing compliance specialist at Cinder Peak Title and Escrow, my entire career revolves around catching the things people try to bury in mountains of paperwork. I look for the missing signatures, the forged dates, the hidden clauses, and the quiet shifts in liability that can ruin a life. My brain is wired to see traps where others see formalities. But on that sunny Saturday afternoon, I was completely off the clock. I was not looking for a trap. I was just a wife sitting in the passenger seat of a mid-size SUV, looking forward to a weekend getaway. My husband, Nate Barrett, was behind the wheel. We were driving up into the high country of Arizona, leaving the desert heat behind for the cooler pines, headed to what was billed as a grand Barrett family reunion. The scene was aggressively normal, the kind of domestic peace that makes you drop your guard completely. The radio was playing classic rock at a low volume. The air conditioning hummed. In the back seat sat a white cardboard box from a bakery we loved, filled with pastries we had bought on a whim. Nate had one hand casually draped over the steering wheel, smiling as he told me a long, winding story about his eccentric uncle and a fishing trip that took place 20 years ago. The sunlight caught the lines around his eyes. He was relaxed. He was happy. "Hey, honey," Nate said, glancing at the dashboard display. "Can you open my phone and check the GPS? I think we might need to take the next exit, but I'm not sure if it routes us through the state route or the back way." "Sure," I said, my voice lazy and warm. I picked up his phone from the center console. It was unlocked. I opened the map application, confirmed that we were supposed to stay on the highway for another 15 miles, and was just about to set the phone down when a notification dropped down from the top of the screen. It was a text message from his older brother. "Dean, I did not mean to snoop." The words simply registered in my brain before I could look away. And the moment I read them, the warm Arizona afternoon vanished, replaced by an ice-cold drop in my stomach. The message read, "Mobile notary confirmed 3:40. Bring Nate identification and the blue tab packet." Keeler says signatures before the toast. I stopped breathing. The classic rock on the radio faded into a dull buzz. The bakery box in the back seat ceased to exist. In my profession, words have weight. They have very specific, very dangerous meanings. A mobile notary is someone you hire when you need legal documents executed urgently and on location. A blue tab packet is an industry shorthand for the crucial signature pages in a heavy stack of real estate or financial documents, the ones flagged with blue sticky notes so the signer knows exactly where to put their name without reading the dense legalese above it. An identification. You do not need a driver license to eat barbecue with your cousins. You need it to legally bind yourself to a contract. Mobile notary. Identification. Blue tab packet. Signatures. Those words never, ever appear in the context of a harmless family barbecue. Those words mean a transaction is closing. They mean a deal has been structured, drafted, and is sitting on a table waiting for blood. "Ava," Nate asked, sensing the sudden shift in my posture, "did we miss the exit?" I looked at him, my sweet, trusting husband who believed his family was gathering to share memories and eat potato salad. They were not. This was not a reunion. It was an ambush. "Pull over," I said. My voice was completely flat. "What?" Nate chuckled, looking at me with a confused smile. "Pull over here. We are on the shoulder of a canyon road. Are you feeling sick? We can stop at the next gas station in about 10 miles. "Nate," I said, turning my body to face him fully. "Pull the car over, right now." He looked at my face and the smile evaporated. Nate knows me. He knows the difference between my tired voice, my annoyed voice, and my professional voice. Right then, I was using the voice of a senior closing compliance specialist who has just caught a multi-million-dollar fraud in the final hour. He engaged the turn signal and guided the heavy SUV onto the gravel shoulder. The tires crunched loudly before we came to a full stop. The dust plumed around us. He put the car in park and turned to me, his eyes wide with genuine concern. "Ava, what is wrong? Are you having a panic attack?" I did not explain. I simply held up his phone so the screen was right in front of his face. I pointed to the message from Dean. "Read it," I commanded. Nate squinted at the screen. I watched his eyes track across the words. Mobile notary confirmed 3:40. Bring Nate identification and the blue tab packet. Keeler says signatures before the toast. He frowned, the gears in his head turning slowly because he was burdened by the innocence of a good man. Mobile notary, blue tab packet. What is Dean talking about? Is he closing on a house or something during the reunion? "No," I said, the coldness in my chest spreading to my limbs. "He is not closing on a house. He is closing on you. Look at the text. Nate, bring your identification. They need your signature." "For what?" he asked, his voice rising in defensive confusion. "My mom just said this was a memorial lunch for Dad. A family get-together. I do not know what the documents are yet," I told him, gripping his arm tightly. "But I know my job. I do this 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week. You do not hire a mobile notary for a weekend party unless you intend to corner someone into signing legally binding documents in front of an audience. They are going to wait until you have a drink in your hand, until everyone is smiling and emotional, and then they are going to slide a stack of papers in front of you and tell you it is just standard housekeeping. They will say it is no big deal. They will pressure you to sign because the notary is waiting and costing them money by the hour." Nate stared at me. I could see the battle in his eyes. He wanted to defend his mother. He wanted to defend his brother. The instinct to protect his bloodline was strong. He wanted to tell me I was being paranoid, that my job had made me cynical. "Ava, it is my family. They would not trick me." "Turn around," I said. I did not yell. I did not plead. I delivered it as an absolute fact. "Turn the car around. Right now. This is not a family party. This is an ambush signing. If you walk into that house, they will put a pen in your hand, and you will sign away something massive just to avoid ruining the afternoon." He looked at the dusty windshield. He looked at the road stretching forward toward the mountains. Then he looked at my eyes. He saw the absolute certainty there. I have never been more grateful for the man I married than in that exact second. Another man might have argued. Another man might have let his ego take the wheel, demanding we go confront them, or worse, demanding we go just to prove me wrong. But Nate did not argue. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. He shifted the SUV into drive, checked his mirrors, and cranked the steering wheel hard to the left. He executed a sharp turn right in the middle of the empty 2-lane highway. The tires squealed faintly against the hot asphalt. We headed back down the mountain, back toward the valley, leaving the so-called reunion behind us. The silence in the car was heavy. It was the silence of a man whose reality had just fractured. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I sat back in my seat, my mind already racing, already building a timeline, already preparing for the war that was inevitably coming. I had just pulled my husband off a ledge he did not even know he was standing on. I looked out the window at the passing red rock formations. The beauty of the Arizona desert suddenly felt harsh and unforgiving. My mind went back to the blue tab packet. In the title and escrow business, we use those tabs for efficiency, yes, but also for control. You guide the signer eyes exactly where you want them, bypassing the dense paragraphs of indemnities, waivers, and quitclaim language. You make it easy for them to surrender their rights. The thought that Dean Barrett, a man who smiled at me over Thanksgiving turkey, had meticulously prepared a blue tab packet for his own brother made me sick to my stomach. This was premeditated. It took coordination. It meant calling a notary, drafting the documents, setting up the venue, and orchestrating a fake celebration just to lower Nate defenses. We drove for about 6 miles before my own phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a message from Tessa. Nate half-sister. Tessa was always the quiet one, the one who hovered on the edges of the Barrett family drama. We had a decent relationship, though we rarely spoke outside of holidays. I opened the message. The text was short, but it hit harder than a physical blow. It read, "Do not let Dean put those papers in front of him." I let out a slow, shaky breath. The last sliver of doubt, the tiny voice in my head wondering if I had overreacted, evaporated instantly. It was confirmed. The trap was real. I turned my phone screen toward Nate, keeping my hand steady. He glanced away from the road for just a second to read Tessa warning. I watched his chest rise and fall as he took a deep breath. His face hardened. He did not say a word. He just pressed his foot harder on the accelerator, putting more distance between us and the family that had just tried to ruin him. The classic rock kept playing, but our lives had fundamentally changed. I walked into our house exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes after Nate made that sudden turn on the Canyon Highway. The ride back to the valley had been suffocating. Nate had not spoken a single word since reading the warning text from his sister. He just stared straight ahead. Gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. When he finally parked the vehicle in our garage, he turned off the engine and just sat there in the dim light. I did not try to comfort him. Comfort was not what we needed right now. We needed facts. I stepped out of the vehicle, walked inside, and bypassed the kitchen entirely. I went straight down the hall to my home office. I did not feel panic. Panic is for people who do not know what is happening. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settling over my mind. This was my territory now. For a decade, I had hunted discrepancies, fraudulent transfers, and hidden liabilities for my corporate clients. Now, the target was my own family. I sat down at my desk, woke up my laptop, and shifted instantly into my professional mode. Logic would have to fight this battle because emotion would only get us killed. First, I needed to secure the initial evidence. I opened the messaging application on my computer, synced to Nate's phone, and took high-resolution screenshots of the text from Dean and the warning from Tessa. I created a new encrypted folder on my desktop and saved the images there. I labeled it with the current date. I was already building a timeline. In my line of work, if it is not documented, it never happened. Next, I opened a blank document and typed out the address Dean had sent for the family reunion. It was located in an affluent, gated community in North Scottsdale. That immediately struck me as wrong. The Barrett family was not wealthy, and they certainly did not live in mega mansions overlooking golf courses. I opened a new browser window and logged into the county assessor database. I typed in the street address and hit search. I bypassed the aesthetic details of the property and went straight to the deed history. The current owner of record was a man named Mason Keeler. The name did not belong to any uncle, cousin, or distant relative Nate had ever mentioned. I opened another tab and ran a professional background search on the name. It took less than 3 seconds for his corporate profile to populate on my screen. Mason Keeler was the regional vice president of Copper Hollow Agricultural Bank. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the monitor. The pieces were clicking together with terrifying precision. A family reunion, hosted at the private residence of an agricultural bank executive, with a mobile notary scheduled for exactly 3:40 in the afternoon. No one hosts a casual family barbecue at a commercial lender house. This was a staged environment. It was designed to look like a social gathering while actually functioning as a secure off-site closing room. They wanted Nate relaxed, surrounded by familiar faces and food, completely unaware that he was walking into a financial transaction orchestrated by a bank vice president. The mobile notary was the executioner waiting in the wings, but what were they executing? I needed to find the entity. People do not move significant assets or take out major commercial loans in their own names. They use shells. They use holding companies. I navigated to the Arizona Corporation Commission portal. I ran a broad entity search using the surname Barrett. Dozens of results appeared. I filtered them by the date of incorporation. narrowing the window to the period immediately following the death of Nate father. Frank Barrett. Frank had passed away just over a year ago, leaving behind a messy estate and a family scrambling to figure out what he actually owned. One result floated to the top of the list: Barrett Heritage Holdings, LLC. It had been formed exactly 11 months ago. The timing was perfectly aligned with the end of the probate period for Frank Estate. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the physical reaction I get whenever I find the buried lie in a stack of closing documents. I paid the state fee, downloaded the Articles of Organization, and opened the PDF file. I scrolled down to the management structure and the member roster. There were 3 names listed. Dean Barrett was listed as the managing member, granting him unilateral control over the daily operations and business decisions of the company. Lorraine Barrett, Nate mother, was listed as a member. And right below her name, listed as a non-managing member, was Nate. My blood ran completely cold. The skin on my arms erupted in goosebumps. Nate had never mentioned this company. He swore to me just last week that his mother and brother were handling the dregs of the estate and that he wanted nothing to do with it. Yet here he was, legally bound to a limited liability company he did not even know existed. To put someone on an operating agreement without their knowledge requires either gross negligence or outright forgery. I did not stop there. I had the entity name, so I went back to the county recorder office database to see what this company actually owned. I ran a grantee search for Barrett Heritage Holdings, LLC. 3 separate deed transfers appeared, all recorded within the last 6 months. I opened each deed one by one. The first was an old, abandoned orange packing warehouse on the outskirts of the county. The building was essentially a liability, full of dry rot and structural issues. The second asset was a collection of grandfathered agricultural water rights. In the desert, water is valuable, but only if you have something to irrigate. The third asset was the dirt itself. It was a parcel of vacant land, exactly 68 acres, located in a desolate area known as Juniper Wash. To the untrained eye, this looked like a collection of worthless rural garbage inherited from a father who made bad investments. But I am not an untrained eye. I am a senior closing compliance specialist. You do not go through the trouble of forming a holding company, paying legal fees, transferring deeds, and coordinating a fake family reunion with a bank vice president for worthless dirt. You do it because the dirt is no longer worthless. This was not some petty scheme to borrow a few $1,000s against an old warehouse. This was a massive title clearing operation. In real estate, before a major buyer will purchase a property, or before a major bank will lend against it, the title must be absolutely pristine. If Frank Barrett left those assets behind, the chain of title was clouded by his death. To sell the land or leverage it, the new entity needed a clear mandate. They needed every single legal heir to sign away their individual rights and ratify the actions of the company. That was the trap. That was the blue tab packet waiting for my husband. Dean and Lorraine had moved the assets into the company, but the title agency or the buyer involved in this hidden transaction must have flagged Nate's missing signature. They needed Nate to sign a member consent form. They needed him to legally acknowledge the company, ratify its ownership of the 68 acres, and waive his right to contest the sale. His signature was the final key required to unlock whatever massive deal Dean had structured behind his back. The documents they had prepared were dirty, filled with liabilities they wanted Nate to absorb while they took the profit. I sat in the quiet of my office, listening to the hum of my computer tower. I had the entire mechanical structure of their betrayal mapped out on my screen. It was brilliant in its cruelty. They had weaponized his grief and his trust in his family. I hit the print command. My heavy-duty office printer sprang to life, churning out the pages of the Articles of Organization, the property deeds, and the corporate profiles. The physical sound of the paper sliding into the tray felt incredibly grounding. It made the invisible threat tangible. I gathered the warm pages, tapped the bottom edge against my desk to align them perfectly, and grabbed a red pen. I circled Nate's name on the member list. I circled the date of incorporation. I walked out of my office and down the hallway to the kitchen. The house was completely silent. Nate was sitting at the kitchen island. He had not poured himself a drink. He had not turned on the television. He was just sitting there, staring blankly at the marble countertop, a man entirely hollowed out by the realization that his brother had tried to serve him on a silver platter. I walked up to the island and placed the thick stack of printed documents right in front of him. The sound of the paper slapping the marble echoed in the large room. He looked down at the documents, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. He looked exhausted, like he had aged 5 years in the span of 2 hours. I looked at him, feeling a fierce, protective anger burning in my chest, but I kept my voice perfectly level, very calm, and completely cold. "Your family was not planning to invite you to lunch," I told him, tapping my index finger on the top page. "They were planning to drag you into a transaction that has been running behind your back." I left my husband staring at the papers on the kitchen island and walked back down the hallway to my office. The air in the house felt heavy and charged with the kind of static electricity that precedes a massive storm. Finding the holding company and the property transfers was only the first layer of the deception. It explained the mechanism of the trap, but it did not explain the motive. People do not orchestrate elaborate ambushes over worthless desert scrub. I needed to know exactly what was sitting on those 68 acres in Juniper Wash. I sat back down at my desk and pulled up the State Department of Transportation planning portal. If a piece of remote land suddenly becomes highly valuable, it is almost always because the government has decided to build something near it. I cross-referenced the parcel map of Juniper Wash with the county zoning overlay and the proposed state infrastructure projects for the next 10 years. It took me 45 minutes of digging through dense municipal planning minutes and preliminary environmental impact studies to find the smoking gun. It was buried in a 300-page proposal slated for public release next month. The state was finalizing the route for a massive new commercial logistics and data center corridor. The planned highway expansion and the new heavy-duty fiber optic lines were designed to run right along the eastern boundary of the Juniper Wash property. For years, whenever the name of Frank Barrett came up at holiday dinners, Lorraine and Dean would roll their eyes and complain about his terrible investments. They called that parcel a barren wasteland, a drain on the property taxes, and a useless burden that Frank refused to let go of out of sheer stubbornness. But Frank had been right. Whether by luck or some quiet insider knowledge he took to his grave, his useless burden was about to become desert gold. The moment the state publicly announced the infrastructure corridor, the value of that land would skyrocket overnight. But Dean was not waiting for the announcement. He was moving now. I needed to understand why he was operating with such desperate speed. I toggled back to the county recorder database. I had searched for deeds transferring the property into the holding company, but I had not searched for encumbrances recorded against the property after the transfer. I ran a new query, searching for any liens, deeds of trust, or agreements tied to Barrett Heritage Holdings. One document populated the screen. It was a memorandum of option to purchase. I downloaded the file and read through the legal jargon. A corporate entity called Redstone Land and Utility had secured the exclusive right to buy the 68 acres. An option agreement is essentially a contract where a buyer pays a fee to lock in a purchase price for a specific period, giving them time to conduct their due diligence. Redstone was quietly tying up the land before the public announcement drove the price into the stratosphere. I scanned the document for the purchase price. When I found the clause, the number made my breath catch in my throat. The agreed-upon strike price for the option was $6,250,000, more than $6 million, and that was just the baseline. I knew from my decade in the industry that if the buyer was willing to lock in that price before the highway and data center corridor were officially announced, the true speculative value of the land was likely double or triple that amount. Dean had found a buyer willing to pay a fortune, and he was trying to close the deal before his brother ever realized what their father had actually left them. But there was a catch. There is always a catch in high-stakes commercial real estate. I read the contingency clauses of the option agreement. Redstone Land and Utility was not going to hand over $6 million blindly. The agreement explicitly stated that the obligation of the buyer to close the transaction was contingent upon receiving a clean title commitment. The title company underwriting the deal had clearly done their homework. They had seen that the estate of Frank Barrett transferred the land to a limited liability company. They had reviewed the operating agreement of that company, and they had noticed that one of the named members had never actually signed the foundational documents. Without a verified signature from Nate, the holding company ownership of the land was contestable. If the ownership was contestable, the title was clouded, and if the title was clouded, Redstone would walk away from the deal, or worse, tie the family up in years of expensive litigation. That was why they were in such a rush. That was why they needed the mobile notary at a fake family reunion. They needed my husband to sign a member ratification, legally cementing his inclusion in the company and validating all the prior transfers Dean had executed behind his back. The entire $6 million house of cards rested on one man putting his pen to paper that afternoon. I kept reading. I scour every page of a contract because the true danger is never on the first page. It is always buried in the exhibits and the addendums at the very back. On page 42 of the PDF file, I found Exhibit C. It was an environmental indemnity agreement. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, parsing the legal terminology. The old orange packing warehouse on the property was not just a rotting eyesore. According to a referenced historical use report, the warehouse had previously operated with several large underground diesel storage tanks to fuel the agricultural equipment. The buyer, Redstone, was fully aware of this, and they were not taking the risk. The addendum stated clearly that the sellers, defined as the individual members of Barrett Heritage Holdings, agreed to personally indemnify and hold the buyer harmless from any and all costs associated with soil remediation, groundwater contamination, and hazardous waste removal stemming from those underground tanks. I felt a physical wave of nausea wash over me. Environmental remediation is the black hole of real estate. If those tanks had leaked diesel fuel into the soil over the last 30 years, the cost to clean it up to commercial standards could easily exceed hundreds of thousands of dollars. It could run into the millions. It could bankrupt a person entirely. I leaned close to the monitor, reading the specific liability phrasing. The indemnity did not just bind the managing member, it explicitly bound any member ratifying post-formation acts. If my husband had walked into that house in Scottsdale, had a beer with his cousins, listened to a tearful toast about his late father, and signed that blue tab packet to help his mother with some estate housekeeping, he would have triggered a catastrophic chain of events. He would have ratified a corporate structure designed to cut him out of a $6 million windfall, while simultaneously volunteering to be personally liable for a toxic waste cleanup he knew nothing about. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The sheer malice of it was staggering. This was not just a greedy brother trying to steal a larger slice of the pie. This was an active, calculated attempt to destroy a family member for profit. The trap was a perfect double-edged sword. Dean was using the legal framework to siphon the massive profit upward to himself and his mother, while pushing the catastrophic environmental risk downward onto his younger brother. They were going to let him smile for the cameras, sign his own financial death warrant, and then foot the bill when the soil tests came back contaminated. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I had all the pieces now. I understood the asset. I understood the buyer. I understood the timeline. And I understood the incredible violence of the trap. They had weaponized the very concept of family loyalty. I opened my eyes and looked at the glowing screen of my monitor. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I had to go back to the kitchen and explain to the man I loved that the people who raised him were entirely willing to sacrifice his future for a payout. I walked back into the kitchen, carrying the heavy weight of what I had just discovered. The printed documents still lay scattered on the marble island exactly where I had left them. Nate had not moved a single inch. He was staring at the papers, his eyes searching the bold headings and the stamped county seals for some kind of rational explanation. There was none to find. I sat down on the bar stool directly across from him. The air between us was thick, suffocating under the pressure of the unspoken truth. I needed to understand the mechanics of the past before I could formulate a plan to protect our future. I knew what the documents said, but I needed to know how his name got on them in the first place. I looked at him and demanded we go back in time. I brought up the date of the holding company formation, exactly 11 months ago. I told him we had to reconstruct that specific window of time. I pushed him to remember the weeks following the burial of his father. I asked him, point blank, if there was any moment, any meeting, any casual encounter during that period where someone put a pen in his hand and asked him for a favor. Nate rubbed his face with both hands, his shoulders slumping under an invisible weight. He looked like a man trying desperately to recall a nightmare he had forced himself to forget. The silence stretched for a long minute. Then, he let out a ragged breath and confessed something he had completely written off as insignificant until this very second. It happened 3 days after the funeral. He told me he was entirely exhausted, shattered by the grief of losing his father, and functioning on maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. His mother, Lorraine, had called him crying. She asked him to come over to the family house to help her sort through the immediate aftermath of the estate. When he arrived, he found her sitting at the formal dining room table, surrounded by manila folders and loose paper. She had a specific stack of documents sitting right in front of her. She called them standard estate housekeeping forms. She poured him a cup of black coffee, wept quietly about how overwhelming the legal process was without Frank there, and told him the family lawyer just needed everything updated immediately so the state would not freeze the bank accounts. Nate admitted to me, his voice breaking slightly, that he did not read a single paragraph of what she put in front of him. He was drowning in his own sorrow and felt completely desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of that house. He just wanted to come back home to me, to the quiet safety of our living room, where I had been nursing him through the shock. He trusted his mother absolutely. In his mind, you do not interrogate the woman who is weeping over the sudden death of her husband. He told me he remembered signing his name multiple times across various pages. I kept my voice deadpan and asked him to describe exactly what those pages looked like. He swallowed hard before answering. He recalled that there were a few pages filled with dense, small text, but at the very bottom of the stack, underneath the bulky paragraphs, there were 2 or 3 pages that were almost entirely blank. They had nothing on them except a signature line at the bottom, and on the edge of those blank pages, someone had carefully attached blue sticky tabs, pointing right to where he needed to sign. He signed them all just to get the ordeal over with, hugged his weeping mother, and walked out the door. I did not scream at him. I did not throw the documents across the room or slam my fists down on the marble counter. I did not react with the explosive anger of a betrayed wife. Instead, I went completely, terrifyingly still. A profound, icy silence settled over me. In my profession, a blank page with a signature line is the equivalent of a loaded weapon with the safety off. You never, ever give someone a blank signature page. That was the missing piece of the puzzle. That was exactly how Barrett Heritage Holdings became a legal reality with his name attached to it. Dean and Lorraine had taken those blank pages, held on to them, attached them to the back of the corporate operating agreement they drafted weeks later, and filed them with the state. My silence was far worse for Nate than any screaming match could ever be. It was the sound of my respect for his judgment hitting the floor and shattering into pieces. I sat there processing the sheer manipulation of it. But Nate was not finished talking. The dam of his guilt had completely broken, and he could not stop the flood. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a new kind of panic, and told me there was something else I needed to know. About 2 years ago, long before his father ever got sick, Lorraine had asked him for a digital copy of his signature. She claimed she was compiling a comprehensive master file of family records. She said she wanted to gather all the emergency contacts, medical directives, and life insurance policies into one secure digital vault, just in case a tragedy ever struck the family. She told him she needed his signature on file to authorize certain family insurance updates and health proxies. Nate, ever the obedient and unquestioning son, had taken a piece of white paper, signed his name clearly in black ink, scanned it at high resolution, and emailed it directly to her. He thought it was a completely normal, responsible request from a mother wanting to keep her family organized. He never once considered that handing over a digital replica of his legal identity was a dangerous act. Hearing that, I felt a fundamental crack run right down the center of our marriage. It was a physical sensation, an ache right behind my ribs. The fracture did not happen because we had fallen out of love. I loved him fiercely, and I knew he loved me. But love is absolutely not enough to sustain a partnership when the gates of the fortress are left wide open and unguarded. I realized in that exact moment that the man I trusted with my life, the man I shared my home and my finances with, had a fatal psychological blind spot. His sheer gullibility, his absolute refusal to see the manipulative tendencies of his own mother, had unlocked the front door of our lives and allowed a financial predator to walk right into our living room. We were exposed to ruin not because Dean was some brilliant criminal mastermind, but because my husband had willingly handed them the keys to his identity. I looked at him, feeling a deep, exhausting sadness wash over the anger. I spoke very slowly, making sure every single word landed exactly where it was supposed to. I told him that the $6 million trap his brother set did not break my heart. I told him it made me furious. It made me want to fight. But it did not break my heart because I expect the world to be greedy and ruthless. I deal with liars every single day. I told him the thing that actually caused me pain. The thing that made me genuinely question our safety together was the fact that he was so deeply conditioned to obey his mother that he gave her a blank check to our entire future. He gave her blank signatures. He gave her a perfect digital copy of his legal identity. He lived his entire adult life in a state of mind where he believed his mother had an inherent, undeniable right to possess things that no human being should ever hold for someone else. I leaned forward, looking straight into his eyes, and said the hardest thing I have ever had to say to him. I told him that his complete inability to draw a hard boundary between his loyalty to his mother and his duty to our marriage was the real threat. The Barrett family scam was just a symptom of the disease. His blind, unquestioning compliance was the disease itself. Nate did not try to defend himself. He did not raise his voice. There were absolutely no excuses left for him to make. He could not say she meant well. He could not say it was just a misunderstanding over paperwork. The printed proof of their betrayal was sitting right in front of him on the marble counter, and his own confessed memories had just convicted him. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting flat on the cold stone. For the first time in his entire life, the comforting illusion of his perfect, loving family was completely gone, burned away by the harsh light of reality. He finally understood what I already knew. The danger we were facing was not a ghost from his past. It was not a distant legal issue happening to other people. The danger had stepped right over our threshold, invited in by his own hand, and was now standing squarely in the middle of our marriage. The morning sun was barely breaking over the horizon when I made the decision. I picked up my phone, dialed my supervisor at Cinder Peak Title and Escrow, and told her I was taking a personal day. I did not offer any elaborate excuses. I simply stated I would be unavailable for the next 24 hours. Once the call ended, I dressed in a sharp, structured blazer and flat shoes. I was not going to work, but I was absolutely going to war. I grabbed my leather briefcase, the one I use for off-site closings, and walked out the door while Nate was still tossing and turning in the bedroom. My destination was the Marlow County Records Office. It took me 45 minutes of highway driving to reach the brutalist concrete building that housed the property history of the entire region. The records office is not a place for the general public. It is a sterile, heavily fluorescent lit labyrinth where title searchers, paralegals, and real estate attorneys go to dig up the past. The air inside always smells faintly of ozone from the massive commercial copiers and the dry dust of aging paper. I walked straight to the clerk desk, pulled out my professional credentials, and requested the complete physical jackets for every single transaction tied to the Juniper Wash parcel, the Orange Packing Warehouse, and Barrett Heritage Holdings. The clerk, a woman who looked like she had been stamping deeds since the 1990s, wheeled over a heavy metal cart loaded with thick manila folders. I took the cart to a secluded corner table in the reading room, far away from the casual researchers. I sat down, opened my briefcase, took out my legal pad, and began the meticulous process of autopsy. I read through every single document as if I were walking through a crime scene that someone had tried very hard to bleach clean, and whoever drafted these papers had done a remarkably good job. To a layman, the stack looked entirely legitimate. There were amendments to the property lines, an affidavit of heirship filed shortly after Frank died, multiple revisions to the operating agreement, and a thick stack of member consent forms. Everything was stamped, notarized, and filed with the precise margins required by the county. It was all valid enough to easily pass through a standard automated banking review. They had built a perfect paper wall to hide the theft, but I do not do automated reviews. I read the margins. I read the dates. I look for the shadow the lie casts. I spent 2 solid hours cross-referencing the dates on the filings with the dates of the actual transfers, and then, buried halfway down the 3rd folder, I found the fatal mistake. It was a document titled Member Ratification and Consent. It was the exact document the title company would need to prove that all members of the holding company, including the non-managing ones, agreed to the pending sale of the Juniper Washland. I looked at the signature block at the bottom of the 2nd page. There it was, my husband name, written out in black ink. I moved my eyes to the top right corner to check the date of execution. The document was dated October 14th of the previous year. The notary stamp next to the signature confirmed that date. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on that specific string of text. October 14th. My mind raced back through our shared calendar. I did not even need to open my phone to verify where we were on that exact day. I knew it with absolute certainty. On the morning of October 14th of last year, Nate and I were sitting in a crowded ballroom in Portland, Oregon. He had accompanied me to a national title insurance conference. We had spent the entire afternoon exploring the city and the evening eating dinner overlooking the river. I still had the hotel receipts, the digital plane tickets, and dozens of photographs of him standing in the rain, completely relaxed and 3 states away from Arizona. It was physically impossible for him to have signed that document in front of a Marlow County notary on that day. I leaned in closer, bringing my face just inches from the page, and stared at the signature itself. Whoever forged it had done an exceptional job. They had clearly used the old digital scan Nate had foolishly emailed to his mother 2 years prior. The loops were correct. The sizing was proportionate. It looked exactly like the signature Nate used to have, but the forger did not know about the accident. 2 years ago, Nate had suffered a severe rotator cuff tear while doing some heavy landscaping in our backyard. The surgery required extensive physical therapy. When he finally regained the use of his right arm, the mechanics of his wrist had fundamentally changed. It was subtle, but his handwriting shifted. Before the surgery, he crossed the double letter T at the end of Barrett with a sharp, upward slant. After the surgery, the stiffness in his shoulder forced him to drag the pen downward, finishing the name with a heavy, descending line. I looked at the forged signature on the county document. The final stroke slashed sharply upward. It was a perfect replica of a ghost. It was the signature of a man who no longer existed, copied by someone who only knew the paperwork version of my husband, not the physical reality of him. The adrenaline hit my bloodstream like ice water. I had them. I had the absolute, undeniable proof of criminal fraud. But I knew Dean. If he was meticulous enough to stage a family reunion to get a signature, he would not leave a loose end like this without a backup plan. I started tearing through the rest of the folder, ignoring the standard boilerplate pages, looking for the safety net they had built for themselves. I found it tucked behind a preliminary title report. It was a limited personal guarantee. This document had not been publicly recorded yet. It was sitting in the file as a draft, fully filled out, and just waiting for a live signature. I read the terms. It was a vicious piece of legal drafting. It explicitly stated that the signatory personally guaranteed any and all financial shortfalls if the buyer contested the validity of the holding company structure. It was designed to completely shield Dean and Lorraine, pushing all the civil liability onto the one person who signed it last, Suddenly, the entire strategy of the fake family reunion made perfect, terrifying sense. They knew the forged ratification from October was a massive risk. If the buyer title company dug too deeply, or if they requested a live voice verification, the forgery would collapse the $6 million deal. So, they hatched a new plan. They would get Nate to sign a fresh, legally binding set of documents in person. They would slide that blue tab packet in front of him, getting him to sign the limited personal guarantee and a new ratification. By signing the new documents, he would inadvertently validate the old forged ones. He would be legally blessing his own financial execution. They were waiting for that reunion to make him clean up their crime scene. I pulled my phone out and began taking high-resolution photographs of every single page. I requested certified, stamped copies of the forged ratification, the unrecorded guarantee, and the notary logs from the clerk. I paid the exorbitant copying fees without a second thought. I took the heavy stack of certified paper back to my table and began building my own file. I created a master timeline on my legal pad. I wrote down who filed what document. I wrote down the date of the option contract with the buyer. I noted the exact date of the forged signature, placing it right next to my notes about the Oregon trip. I mapped out exactly which document needed my husband to ratify the others to cover the fatal flaws in the chain of title. I built an airtight, irrefutable narrative of conspiracy. When I finally packed my briefcase and walked out of the Marlow County Records Office, the afternoon sun was blindingly bright. The heat radiating off the pavement was intense, but I felt nothing but a cold, calculating calm. There was no longer a shadow of a doubt in my mind. This was no longer a suspicion based on a poorly timed text message. It was a verified, documented fact. Someone in that family, guided by Dean and facilitated by Lorraine, had stolen my husband's name. They had used his identity to pave a golden road toward a multi-million-dollar payday, and then they had invited him to a barbecue to politely ask him to step into a trap that would lock him out of the money and chain him to the risk. I drove out to meet Tessa late Tuesday evening. She had chosen the location herself, insisting we meet far away from any neighborhood where a Barrett family member might accidentally spot us. The destination was a desolate parking lot outside a small, run-down supermarket in a town called Dry River, about 40 minutes outside the city limits. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised, dark purple. The parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated only by a few flickering overhead lights that cast long, distorted shadows across the cracked asphalt. I parked my vehicle near the edge of the lot, keeping the engine running and the doors locked. 10 minutes later, a silver sedan pulled into the space right next to mine. I watched through the glass as Tessa turned off her headlights. She sat in her car for a long moment, staring straight ahead, before finally opening her door and stepping out into the warm night air. She walked over to my passenger side. I unlocked the door, and she slid into the seat, bringing with her the faint smell of stale coffee and sheer nervous exhaustion. Tessa looked terrible. Her face was pale, drawn tight with anxiety, and dark circles hung heavily beneath her eyes. She looked exactly like a person who had been awake for 3 consecutive nights, completely crushed by the weight of a secret she could no longer carry. She kept her hands tightly clasped in her lap to stop them from shaking. For a long time, neither of us said a word. The only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I did not push her. I simply waited, letting the silence press down on her until she was ready to break. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit like a physical blow. She told me that her brother Dean was not just acting on behalf of the family. He was the sole architect of the entire timeline, driving the frantic pace of the transaction because he had backed himself into a corner of his own making. Dean had secretly taken a massive cash advance from the land broker facilitating the deal. He had accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in non-refundable earnest money long before the holding company had a legally clear title to sell. He had used that advance to pay off his own mounting business debts, assuming he could simply bully his younger brother into signing the final paperwork whenever he needed to. But then the timeline accelerated. The state was moving faster than Dean had anticipated with their infrastructure plans. Dean was suddenly trapped. He had to deliver a pristine title to the buyer immediately, or he would be in breach of his backroom contract. If the deal collapsed now, the broker would demand the advance payment back, and Dean would be facing total financial ruin. That was why he could not wait. That was why he had orchestrated the ambush. I listened to her, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I asked her to explain exactly how they had planned to execute it at the house in Scottsdale. I needed to know the anatomy of the betrayal. Tessa took a shaky breath and confessed that the entire gathering was a meticulously rehearsed stage play. It was never a reunion. It was an emotional slaughterhouse designed specifically for Nate. She detailed the script they had agreed upon. When Nate walked through the door, he was supposed to be greeted with overwhelming warmth. They had planned to serve his favorite food and play the music his father used to love. Dean was instructed to act unusually kind and nostalgic. Then, right after the main course, Lorraine was supposed to stand up and deliver a tearful toast to Frank memory. She was going to cry. She was going to talk about how hard it had been since he died, and how much she relied on her boys to keep the family strong. Tessa looked down at her shaking hands and told me that the mobile notary was instructed to wait out of sight in the home office. The moment Lorraine started crying, the notary was supposed to walk into the dining room. It was psychological warfare. They were going to hit Nate with the paperwork at the exact second his emotional defenses were completely destroyed by his grieving mother. Tessa explained the physical structure of the documents. Dean had personally arranged the blue tab packet. He placed several harmless tax update forms on the very top of the stack. Those were the pages he would encourage Nate to read. But the binding legal documents, the ratification clauses, and the devastating liability waivers were buried at the very bottom. The blue sticky tabs were placed perfectly, so Nate could just flip the corners and sign his name blindly, trusting that the dense paragraphs above his signature were exactly what his mother claimed they were. They even had a unified script prepared. If Nate hesitated, if he asked to read the bottom pages, every single family member at the table was instructed to repeat the exact same lie. They were all going to say it was just standard administrative updating so the land would not get suspended in probate court. They were going to look him in the eye and tell him he just needed to sign to help his mother find some peace. Hearing her describe the absolute calculated cruelty of it made my blood run cold. It was one thing to forge a signature in private. It was something entirely different to gather an entire family around a dining room table and assign them roles in a conspiracy to destroy one of their own. But Dean was a thorough man, and he knew there was one variable he could not control with tears and fake nostalgia. He could not control me. Tessa turned to look at me, her eyes filled with deep shame. She admitted that Dean had anticipated my resistance. He knew that as a compliance specialist, I would immediately recognize a trap if I saw the papers. So, he had spent the last 3 weeks quietly planting seeds of doubt in the family, preparing a coordinated smear campaign against my character. If I tried to stop Nate from signing, Dean was going to launch a full verbal assault. He was going to publicly brand me as a controlling outsider who wanted to tear the Barrett brothers apart. He had instructed Lorraine to tell Nate that I was clinically paranoid because of my profession, that I saw fraud everywhere, and that I was trying to project my corporate cynicism onto their sacred family bond. They were fully prepared to isolate me, to make Nate choose between the wife who was supposedly ruining a beautiful family moment and the weeping mother who just needed his help. They wanted to break my marriage just to secure a signature. Tessa reached into her large leather purse and pulled out a standard white envelope. Her hand trembled as she held it out to me. I took it, broke the seal, and slid out 3 glossy photographs. She told me she had snuck into Dean home office during a family dinner the week before the planned reunion. She had used her phone to take pictures of the papers scattered across his desk. She had printed them out at a local pharmacy to avoid leaving any digital trace of sending them to me. I turned on the overhead dome light in the car and looked at the photographs. The first 2 were blurry shots of the holding company ledgers, confirming the massive cash advance Tessa had mentioned. But the third photograph was the smoking gun. It was a clear, overhead shot of a yellow legal pad. The handwriting was unmistakably Dean Sharp, aggressive script. It was a bulleted checklist for the reunion. I read the final line on the page. It said exactly this: "Get Nate to sign before corridor notice hits." I stared at that specific line for a long time. The dome light cast a harsh glare over the glossy paper. That single sentence stripped away the last remaining illusion of family obligation. Dean was not rushing because the buyer was impatient. He was not rushing because of the cash advance alone. He was rushing because he knew the state government was about to issue a public notice regarding the new commercial infrastructure corridor. Once that public notice hit the evening news, the secret would be out. Every single person in the county would know that the barren land in Juniper Wash was suddenly worth a massive fortune. If Nate saw that news broadcast, he would immediately demand an appraisal. He would hire his own lawyer. He would never, under any circumstances, sign a blind ratification that surrendered his ownership rights and chained him to a toxic environmental liability. Dean had to close the trap before the state turned on the lights. I carefully slid the photographs back into the white envelope and placed it securely in my briefcase on the back seat. I turned off the dome light, plunging the car back into darkness. I looked over at Tessa. She was crying quietly now, the tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks down her pale cheeks. She had betrayed her mother and her oldest brother, but in doing so, she had given me the exact ammunition I needed to tear their entire operation apart. I told her she did the right thing. I told her to go home, to stay completely quiet, and to act like everything was normal. I promised her that when the explosion finally happened, I would make sure she was standing far away from the blast radius. She nodded weakly, opened the passenger door, and stepped out into the empty parking lot. I watched her walk back to her silver sedan, get in, and drive away into the dark. I sat alone in my car for a few minutes, listening to the engine idle. I now possessed the complete blueprint of their malice. They had built a perfect machine to destroy my husband, but they had made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was just a spectator. They were about to learn exactly what happens when you try to run a fraudulent closing on a woman who dismantles them for a living. The doorbell rang just past 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, feeling the exhaustion of the past 48 hours settling deep into my bones. Nate walked down the hallway and opened the front door. I heard the low murmur of voices, and then a sudden, chilling shift in the atmosphere of our home. It was Lorraine. She stepped into our entryway, holding a glass baking dish covered tightly in aluminum foil. The sweet, heavy scent of warm peach cobbler immediately filled the space, clashing violently with the cold, hard reality of the documents sitting on my desk just a few rooms away. She did not storm into the house. She did not raise her voice or demand an explanation for why we had skipped the gathering in Scottsdale. Instead, she walked into my kitchen looking small, frail, and profoundly wounded. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the baking dish on the marble counter. She wore a soft knit cardigan, and her eyes were already rimmed with red. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She was deploying the ultimate defense mechanism of the guilty. She was playing the victim. Nate pulled out a bar stool for her, his face pale and tense. Lorraine sat down, wrapped her shaking hands around the edge of the counter, and began to spin a narrative so completely detached from the truth that it left me momentarily speechless. Her voice shook as she painted a picture of a family on the brink of absolute ruin. According to Lorraine, Frank had not left behind a hidden fortune. He had left behind a disastrous, tangled mess of unrecorded debts, boundary disputes, and looming lawsuits. She claimed that the holding company was just a desperate attempt to shield the family assets from aggressive creditors. She painted Dean not as a mastermind seeking a massive payout, but as a martyr. She said Dean was losing sleep, working himself to the bone, taking on massive personal stress just to keep the estate afloat so they would not all lose everything. Then, she turned her tear-filled eyes toward me. The warmth vanished from her gaze, replaced by a subtle, cutting resentment. She told Nate, right in front of me, that I was blowing a simple paperwork misunderstanding wildly out of proportion. She used a soft, patronizing tone to suggest that because I dealt with corporate fraud all day, I was projecting my cynical worldview onto their simple family housekeeping. She said I had never truly made an effort to understand the Barrett family dynamics, and that my constant need for control was tearing her boys apart. I stood perfectly still, watching the performance. I knew the exact dollar amount of the option contract. I had seen the forged signature, but Nate had only seen the papers through my eyes. And now, he was seeing his mother crying in his kitchen, right on cue. Her tears began to fall. They spilled over her cheeks as she talked about standing over Frank at the funeral, feeling completely alone. And then, she went straight for the most vulnerable part of my history. She looked at me and brought up the winter 3 years ago when I had suffered a severe physical burnout and a deeply painful personal loss. She reminded us both, her voice thick with emotion, how she had driven over to our house every single afternoon to bring me soup, to sit by my bed, to make sure I was not alone while Nate was at work. She weaponized my past grief, declaring that family loyalty was a sacred bond, that they take care of each other no matter what, and that she could not believe I would accuse them of something so evil. I watched the resolve completely drain out of my husband. The man who had been ready to fight alongside me just hours ago was now crumbling under the weight of his own guilt. Nate was paralyzed by the fear that he was criminalizing his grieving mother over legal jargon he did not fully understand. He reached out and put his hand over hers. He started apologizing. He started making excuses for Dean, suggesting that maybe his brother was just being sloppy and aggressive, rather than actively malicious. He could not bear the psychological agony of calling his mother a fraud to her face. When Lorraine finally left, leaving the untouched peach cobbler on the counter as a monument to her suffering, the house felt like a sealed pressure cooker. Nate and I had the most vicious, destructive argument of our entire relationship. It started in the kitchen and spilled out into the hallway, our voices echoing against the walls. I refused to back down. I pointed at my office, telling him that the county records did not cry, the option contract did not bake pies, and the forged signature did not care about his childhood memories. I told him this was not a complicated family dynamic, but a highly structured, predatory legal trap, Nate shouted back, his face flushed with anger and desperation. He accused me of treating his family like a hostile corporate takeover. He said I was turning a misunderstanding into a nuclear war with no exit strategy. He told me I was so obsessed with being right, so obsessed with finding the lie, that I was willing to destroy his relationship with his mother without giving her a single ounce of grace. The words hit me harder than a physical strike. The profound isolation of that moment was suffocating. I realized I was standing inside the house I helped build, looking at the man I loved, and I was completely alone. He was actively fighting me to stay on a sinking ship. A quiet, devastating clarity settled over me. I stopped yelling. I lowered my voice to a whisper and told him I could not do this anymore. I turned around, walked into our bedroom, pulled my canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet, and began tossing clothes into it. I was going to a hotel. I was not leaving him because I wanted a divorce. I was leaving because I could not save his life while he was actively standing in front of the people trying to ruin him. I could not watch him choose his abusers over the woman trying to protect him. The sound of the zipper closing on my bag was incredibly loud in the silent bedroom. I picked up my car keys. While I was packing, Nate had walked into my home office to try and calm his breathing. He stood in the dark room, illuminated only by the glow of the street lamp outside. He looked down at the desk, where all my printed evidence lay scattered. Sitting right on top of the pile was the glossy photograph Tessa had given me in the supermarket parking lot, the picture of the yellow legal pad, Dean handwritten checklist. I walked out of the bedroom, carrying my bag, ready to walk out the front door. Nate stepped out of the office. He looked like all the blood had been completely drained from his body. His hands were shaking violently. He was holding the glossy photograph. He did not look at me. He just stared at the piece of paper in his hand. He had read the final line at the bottom of the page, the contingency plan Dean had written out for the reunion. Use mom first. If Ava blocks, make Nate choose blood. The silence in the hallway was absolute. The illusion did not just crack, it shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Nate stood there, holding the proof that his mother tears, her trembling voice, the peach cobbler, the memories of my illness. All of it was a calculated, pre-planned tactical deployment. It was a script written by his brother and eagerly performed by his mother just to get his signature on a liability waiver. He finally understood that he was not just being scammed by paperwork. He was being manipulated by his own foundational love for his family. The trap was built entirely out of his own trust. He dropped the photograph on the hardwood floor, looked up at me with tears in his eyes, and finally saw the truth. I dropped my canvas duffel bag on the hardwood floor of our hallway. I did not go to a hotel. Leaving was the reaction of a woman who felt defeated, and after seeing that handwritten checklist, I felt nothing but a terrifying, focused energy. Nate was finally awake. The comforting illusion of his loving family had burned to the ground right in front of him, leaving only the charred remains of the truth. We had work to do. By 9 o'clock the following morning, we were sitting in the heavily soundproofed conference room of Noah Bell. Noah was a discreet, ruthlessly sharp real estate attorney who operated out of a modest brick building downtown. He did not advertise on billboards. He did not run television commercials. People hired Noah when they needed to surgically dismantle a fraudulent commercial deal without leaving any fingerprints behind. I slid my compiled folders across his polished mahogany table. Noah did not ask for a summary. He put on his reading glasses and spent 2 silent hours reading every single page. The only sound in the room was the crisp turning of heavy paper. When he finally looked up, he took off his glasses and looked directly at Nate. He did not just confirm my previous suspicions, he made them infinitely worse. I had found the environmental indemnity clause earlier, but Noah possessed the resources to dig much deeper than a standard county search. He pulled up the historical municipal records and found the actual preliminary environmental site assessment that Frank Barrett had commissioned nearly 2 decades ago. It was a dusty, forgotten document that Dean had desperately tried to bury. Noah slid the thick report across the table. It explicitly detailed the condition of the underground diesel tanks beneath the old packing warehouse. The tanks were not just old and non-compliant. They had been actively leaking diesel fuel into the surrounding soil and the shallow groundwater table for years. The estimated cost for soil remediation, hazardous waste removal, and state compliance testing, if the land were ever redeveloped for commercial use, was projected to be upwards of $800,000. In the current market, factoring in inflation and stricter Environmental Protection Agency guidelines, Noah warned us that the number could easily exceed $1 million. Then, Noah laid the indemnity addendum flat on the table and tapped his expensive silver pen against a specific string of text. He explained the exact legal mechanics of the trap with cold precision. The indemnity did not hold the Barrett Heritage Holdings Company liable as a whole. It did not hold the managing member, Dean, personally liable for the cleanup. The liability was surgically attached to a highly specific, very intentional phrase. The phrase read, "Any member ratifying post-formation acts." Noah leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He told my husband that they had structured the corporate entity to absorb all the profit from the $6 million sale. But they had drafted this specific addendum to catch the one person who signs the ratification document late. If Nate had signed that blue tab packet at the reunion, he would have absorbed 100% of the environmental cleanup cost as a personal guarantor. They would walk away with millions in clean cash. Nate would walk away with $1 million invoice from the federal government and a contaminated piece of dirt. It was no longer just a theory of risk shifting. It was a weaponized legal document designed to completely ruin him. But to completely destroy Dean in a court of law, we needed more than just a bad contract. We needed to prove active malice. We needed to prove they knew exactly what they were doing when they drafted it. Noah asked Nate for access to every single email account associated with the Barrett estate. Nate, still shaken to his core, handed over his laptop. He explained that he had access to an old archive inbox that originally belonged to his father. It was an account set up to catch forwarded mail from Frank's original business address. Nate had never bothered to check it because he assumed it was just filled with old spam and expired subscriptions. Noah connected the laptop to the conference room monitor and ran a targeted keyword search through thousands of unread messages. He searched for the name of the holding company, the name of the buyer, and the name of the transaction assistant listed on the county paperwork. The search yielded one single result. It was an email sent exactly 3 weeks ago. The transaction assistant at the title company handling the Redstone deal had made a fatal administrative error. Instead of sending an internal update to Dean's private email address, she had accidentally hit reply all on an old thread, sending the message directly into Frank's archived inbox. Noah clicked on the message. The text illuminated the large screen on the wall. The email was a brief status update regarding the stalled option contract, but it was the second paragraph that blew the entire conspiracy wide open. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of premeditation. The assistant wrote, "Once Nate signs, exposure shifts and option can close without member contest." I read the words again and again. Exposure shifts. They were not confused about the estate paperwork. They were not just trying to clean up a messy title. They were having active, documented conversations with their escrow team about legally shifting the toxic exposure away from themselves and squarely onto my husband's shoulders. I sat back in my leather chair. The sheer audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Dean had engineered a scenario where he would collect millions, while Nate would be bankrupted by federal fines, all wrapped up in a false narrative of helping their grieving mother find peace. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in Noah's office, consolidating every single piece of evidence. I built the ultimate master file. I organized the documents in chronological order of their betrayal. First, the certified county documents proving the forged signature. Second, my timeline cross-referencing the date of the forgery with our trip to Oregon. Third, the glossy photograph of the handwritten checklist, proving the coordinated manipulation using his mother. Fourth, the undervalued option contract proving the true financial motive. Fifth, the historical environmental report proving the massive financial hazard. And finally, the misdirected email proving the deliberate shift of liability. I did not just have a defense anymore. I had an execution block. I looked at Nate. He was staring at the thick binder I had just assembled. The paralyzing grief over losing the illusion of his family was completely gone. It had been rapidly replaced by something much more useful. It was a cold, hard, unyielding anger. Noah closed his legal pad and asked us what we wanted to do next. He offered to file an immediate injunction to freeze the holding company assets. He offered to send a cease and desist letter to the buyer and tie the land up in litigation for years. I shook my head immediately. A quiet legal letter would allow Dean and Lorraine to play the victim again. It would allow them to claim they made an honest mistake and hide behind their lawyers in the shadows. I was not going to give them the luxury of a quiet retreat. They had tried to ambush my husband in front of his entire family, using tears and memories as weapons. I looked at my husband, and he nodded. I turned back to Noah and told him we were not going to stop the transaction quietly. We were going to prepare a single, perfectly clean counterattack. Instead of retreating into the safety of an immediate legal injunction, we chose a much more dangerous path. We decided to walk directly into the jaws of the trap they had set for us. It took exactly 48 hours to set the stage. Nate picked up his phone and called his mother. He played his part flawlessly, though I could see the physical toll it took on him to swallow his pride and feign ignorance. He told Lorraine that tempers had simply flared, that the stress of his job and the lingering grief over his father had made us both overly sensitive. He apologized for missing the gathering in Scottsdale and suggested we make up for it. The bait was taken instantly. Within 2 hours, Dean had organized a makeup event. They called it a memorial lunch, scheduled for 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon at a rented luxury lodge in Ironwood Ridge. On the surface, this was billed as a beautiful afternoon of family healing. They promised good food, fond memories, and a chance to finally put the estate tension behind us. In reality, I knew exactly what it was. It was their second attempt. It was a rapid redeployment of the blue tab packet. Dean was running out of time before the state infrastructure announcement hit the news, and he desperately needed that signature. But this time, I wanted the ambush to happen right in front of every single person who had a hand in building it. Our attorney, Noah Bell, was entirely prepared for the fallout. He had drafted an emergency restraining order and a formal notice of pending litigation that would immediately freeze any attempt to transfer or encumber the property. But we explicitly instructed him not to file the paperwork with the county court yet. Filing early would tip our hand. It would give Dean the opportunity to destroy internal communications, shred the drafted liability waivers, and claim it was all a giant misunderstanding. I did not want them to have the luxury of plausible deniability. I wanted them to slide the fraudulent documents across a dining table in front of witnesses. I wanted to catch the structure of their lie in the open air, fully exposed. We also had an inside ally ready to make her move. I had spoken with Tessa over a secure line late Friday night. She agreed to attend the memorial lunch. It was a terrifying decision for her. She knew that by standing with us, she was effectively excommunicating herself from her mother and her older brother forever. The Barrett family as she knew it would cease to exist after Sunday afternoon. But she told me she could no longer stomach the suffocating weight of their greed. She was going to be in that room, and for the first time in her life, she was going to publicly defy the man who had treated her like a subordinate for decades. Saturday evening, the night before the lunch, Nate and I sat at our kitchen island and established our absolute rules of engagement. This was not going to be a screaming match. It was going to be an execution. We agreed that he would not sign a single piece of paper, no matter how much pressure they applied. If Dean or Lorraine pushed the blue tab packet in front of him, Nate was going to pull the stack apart. He was going to read the title of every single document out loud, projecting his voice so every aunt, uncle, and cousin in the room could hear the exact legal terminology of the trap. We promised each other there would be no yelling, no cursing, and no loss of emotional control. We were going to let the cold, hard facts suck the oxygen right out of the room. Despite the meticulous preparation, a massive knot of tension remained tightly coiled in my chest. The central unknown variable was Lorraine. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the dark ceiling of our bedroom, turning the question over and over in my mind. How much did she actually know? Was she the mastermind who had authorized the forgery and orchestrated the environmental liability shift from the very beginning? Or was she just a pawn? A grieving widow manipulated by Dean and his relentless fear-mongering about losing the family assets to imaginary creditors? I genuinely did not know which reality was worse. A mother who actively tries to destroy her son for cash, or a mother who is so utterly blind to the cruelty of her favored child that she willingly hands him the knife. But the most terrifying aspect of the night was not about the real estate, the money, or the fraudulent paperwork. It was about the man sleeping next to me. This was no longer just a battle over a commercial land deal. This was the defining crossroads of our entire marriage. For his whole life, Nate had been the accommodating son. He had been conditioned to yield, to apologize, to absorb the toxic behavior of his family in the name of keeping the peace. Tomorrow, he was going to have to stand up in a crowded room and look his mother in the eye while he dismantled her lies. He was going to have to choose between the family he came from and the family he had built with me. If he wavered, if the tears and the guilt trips broke his resolve at the final second, there would be nothing left for me to save. I would have to pack my bags for good. Sunday morning arrived with a blinding, harsh desert sun. We dressed in silence. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, the kind of armor I wear when I walk into a hostile corporate room. Nate wore a dark button-down shirt, his jaw set, his eyes completely devoid of the soft, trusting warmth they usually held. We drove out toward Ironwood Ridge, leaving the city behind as the landscape shifted into rugged hills and deep canyons. The rented lodge was an impressive structure of glass and dark timber, sitting elegantly against a backdrop of red rock. The parking lot was already full of vehicles belonging to the extended Barrett family. Nate pulled our car into an empty space near the edge of the gravel lot. He put the vehicle in park, but did not immediately turn off the engine. We sat there in the cool cabin. The dashboard clock read 12:45. It was the exact same physical setup as the day on the highway a week ago. We were sitting in the same seats, facing a gathering of the same people, knowing a trap was waiting for us inside, but the dynamic had entirely shifted. Last time, we had slammed on the brakes and turned around to escape the danger. We had run from the unknown. Today, there was no fear of the unknown. We knew the anatomy of the beast waiting behind those timber doors. We knew its exact price, its methods, and its weaknesses. I turned to look at my husband. He took a long, slow breath, unbuckled his seatbelt, and reached over to turn off the ignition. The engine fell silent. He looked back at me, his expression resolute and completely unyielding. We were not turning the car around this time. We opened the doors and stepped out into the dry heat, ready to walk straight into the ambush and snap the jaws of the trap backward onto the hands of the people who set it. We walked through the heavy timber doors of the rented luxury lodge in Ironwood Ridge right at noon. The interior was massive, featuring high vaulted ceilings, exposed wooden beams, and expansive glass windows overlooking the desert valley. The Barrett family had spared no expense in constructing their illusion. A long buffet table was covered with expensive catered food, from roasted meats to elaborate salads. In the very center of the main dining space, surrounded by tasteful floral arrangements, sat a large framed photograph of Frank Barrett. The room was packed with aunts, uncles, and cousins, all speaking in hushed, respectful tones. It looked exactly like a dignified, loving memorial service. We took our assigned seats near the head of the main table. The air was thick with the smell of rich food and false sympathy. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for the performance to begin. Right at 1:15 in the afternoon. The clinking of silverware stopped as Dean stood up from his chair. He tapped his crystal water glass with a spoon to command the attention of the room. He delivered his opening monologue exactly as Tessa had warned me he would. He spoke softly about the legacy of their father. He talked about the enduring strength of the Barrett bloodline and how crucial it was for the family to remain completely united during times of grief. Then, he turned his gaze down to my husband. With a perfectly rehearsed sad smile, Dean reached under the table and produced the thick stack of legal documents. The blue sticky tabs protruded clearly from the bottom edges. He slid the packet directly across the polished mahogany table toward Nate. He patted Nate on the shoulder and delivered his final, calculated line. He asked Nate to just sign the papers for their mother, claiming it was nothing more than a simple administrative update to keep the estate property from getting tangled up in expensive probate procedures. Nate did not pick up the expensive pen resting next to the packet. He did not look at his mother. He reached out and pulled the heavy stack of paper toward his chest. Instead of flipping to the blue tabs, Nate peeled back the harmless tax forms sitting on top. He squared his shoulders, took a deep breath, and began reading the bold, capitalized headings of the buried documents aloud. He projected his voice so it echoed off the high timber ceilings, ensuring every single relative in the room heard the exact legal terminology. He read them one by one. Member ratification, limited personal guarantee, environmental indemnity, consent to option closing. The dining room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The older relatives exchanged highly confused glances. The younger cousins stopped eating. Lorraine immediately panicked. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes wide, attempting to regain control of the narrative. She waved her trembling hand in the air and told the room that those words were just standard lawyer language, that the bank required complicated phrasing, and that Nate was making a big deal out of standard filing forms. I did not let her finish her sentence. I stood up from my chair. I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out the massive, heavily documented master file I had built, and dropped it right onto the center of the table. The heavy thud made the crystal glasses rattle. I looked directly at Lorraine and asked the entire room a very simple question. I asked if anyone would like me to read the internal corporate email detailing exactly how the title company and Dean planned to shift all the toxic environmental exposure onto my husband the moment he signed those pages. Before Dean could raise his voice to shut me down, a chair scraped loudly against the floor at the far end of the table. Tessa stood up. She walked forward, her hands shaking slightly but her posture completely rigid. She reached the center of the table and tossed 2 glossy photographs onto the wood right next to my binder. One was the clear image of Dean handwritten checklist. The other was the photograph of the cardboard box sitting in his home office, clearly labeled with the words, Nate exit packet. Tessa turned to face her mother and her oldest brother. Her voice broke, but she spoke loud enough for the whole room to hear. She told them that this gathering was a lie, and that this transaction was never about preserving the land for the family. Dean's face turned dark red with fury. He opened his mouth to shout at his sister, but the climax of the afternoon arrived before he could form a single word. The heavy timber doors at the entrance of the dining room swung open. Noah Bell stepped into the lodge. He was not alone. Flanking him were 2 individuals dressed in sharp, immaculate corporate attire. The room watched in stunned silence as Noah walked confidently toward the head of the table and introduced the 2 men. One was the senior legal counsel representing Redstone Land and Utility. The other was the regional head of fraud prevention for Copper Hollow Agricultural Bank. We had not kept the evidence to ourselves. Exactly 30 minutes before we walked into the lodge, Noah had securely transmitted our complete master file to the legal departments of the buyer and the lending institution. We brought the authorities directly to the family lunch. Standing right in front of the entire Barrett extended family, the corporate executives delivered 3 devastating announcements that completely shattered the conspiracy. First, the Redstone attorney announced that the $6 million option contract was immediately suspended, pending a full federal investigation into corporate member fraud and undisclosed environmental hazards. Second, the bank executive declared that every single county document bearing the signature of my husband from the previous year was officially flagged for invalidation due to irrefutable proof of forgery. Third, the final blow came when the Redstone attorney looked directly at Dean with absolute contempt. He revealed the true estimated value of the Juniper Wash parcel. He stated plainly that with the upcoming state infrastructure and data center corridor being finalized, the dirt was actually worth multiple times the artificially low strike price Dean had so desperately tried to lock in. I turned my attention away from Dean and watched Lorraine. She physically collapsed back into her chair, all the color completely drained from her face. She was not crying because I had exposed their secret. She was crying because the devastating mathematical reality finally clicked in her head. She suddenly realized the horrifying depth of what her oldest son had done. Dean was not just trying to steal from his younger brother. By rushing the sale at a massive discount and structuring the holding company to absorb the initial payout, Dean was planning to take his massive cut, leave his mother with a fraction of the actual land value, and let the entire family structure collapse under the crushing weight of the environmental cleanup costs. He had eagerly used his grieving mother tears to facilitate his own wealthy escape. Lorraine finally understood that she was never a partner in his scheme. She was just another victim he was willing to sacrifice. Dean stood completely frozen. His jaw was tightly clenched, his eyes darting frantically around the room as he watched his reputation, his financial future, and his entire career dissolve into dust in front of his family. Then, Nate stood up. He did not yell. He did not throw anything. He looked at his brother and his mother with a cold, absolute detachment that was far more punishing than anger. He announced to the silent, staring room that from this exact moment forward, any communication regarding the estate, the property, or any family assets must go exclusively through his legal counsel. He officially and publicly revoked any implied or historical access to his legal identity, and he promised, with unwavering conviction, that if anyone in that room were attempted to use his name or his signature on a piece of paper ever again, he would ensure they faced criminal prosecution to the absolute fullest extent of the law. We did not stay to eat the catered lunch. Nate took my hand, and we turned around and walked out the heavy timber doors together, leaving the Barrett family sitting in the complete ruins of their own greed. The drive back down the mountain highway was enveloped in a profound, heavy silence. The adrenaline of the confrontation was rapidly fading from my bloodstream, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion in my bones. But as I leaned my head against the passenger window and looked at the profile of my husband against the passing desert landscape, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. We had not won an easy victory. We had walked through fire. But as the miles rolled by, I knew we had achieved something monumental. Dean was completely isolated. The fraudulent deal was frozen indefinitely, and the forged documents had become the exact evidence that would destroy his professional life. Lorraine had lost her manipulative control, forced to face the ugly truth of her favorite son instead of hiding behind the sacred shield of family loyalty. And we had survived. We had saved our marriage, we had secured our financial future, and we had pulled Nate back from the edge of a catastrophic betrayal served right across his own family dining table. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.